Welcome to TheoryCast, a show where we review the books that people want to read but don't have the time to. If you've ever been told to read theory by an internet lefty, you want to better understand the ideas that shape the world around us, or just don't like long books, then this is the place for you. We're going to review first Debt, the First 5,000 Years from anthropologist David Graeber. We're going to be doing a chapter by chapter breakdown. We'll do our best to introduce his main ideas, tie them back to his central thesis, and provide the most important piece of evidence that he presents. This account includes things like how various civilizations have treated debt, some theories of money, how debts to things like society and commercial transactions overlap in our language, and how that shapes how we think about things, how our current ideas of the market and commerce have been shaped. The book overall is difficult to quantify as just one thing, as a historical or economic or philosophical work, partially because of the book's length and varied subject matter, and partially because his thesis suggests that these things are all essentially tied together in a way that can't be pulled apart without losing something. The book opens with some thoughts about our modern preconceptions of debt, some of the language surrounding it, how debts can be both moral and financial, and how that plays into how these things play into each other. It examines what he calls myths that the field of economics is built on, and suggests that most modern conceptions of something called the economy make little sense outside of some very strict assumptions. He examines theories for how money is created and the idea that states and markets are separate things. He then begins somewhat of a historical account of debt in various forms across civilizations, what they thought debt was for, how creditor and debtors were viewed morally. He argues that many of the things we take for granted about money, coinage, and credit are contingent on a specific set of circumstances, and compares various historical conceptions of these things. After each chapter, we'll do a brief discussion of some of the ideas and how we think they relate to us, the larger world, and other texts. Surely one has to pay one's debts. The book opens with an anecdote about a conversation at a party where the idea is expressed, and the author is struck by the difference between his historical perspective as an anthropologist and the mainstream consensus around the idea of debt at our current moment. He presents the central question of his work as what precisely does it mean to say that our sense of morality and justice is reduced to the language of a business deal? What does it mean when we reduce moral obligations to debts? What changes when one turns into the other? And how do we speak about them when our language has been shaped by the market? There are several pieces to this, which break down into a couple of salient points, which are referenced in the first chapter. Debt in the third world versus debt in the first world, debt for the rich and the poor, debt in violence, and debt in religion and culture. To illustrate the first point, the author references his work against the IMF, specifically that in the late 70s and 80s, banks made a series of risky loans to third world strongmen who proceeded to stash the money in Switzerland or dole it out to cronies while leaving the loan on the public balance sheet. After changes in government, the IMF steps in and conditions any financial help or bailout money for these impoverished nations on strict repayment of these loans, acting as a sort of collector for global capital and enforcing a strict austerity budget if they continue to want support. The result of this in one instance was the cutting of a malaria eradication program in Madagascar that led to about 10,000 deaths after an outbreak. This form of hierarchy can even be seen in a more modern context in the European Union, where after the financial crisis, the EU mandated austerity and balanced budgets after the crash and the bailouts in the name of fiscal responsibility, but also to make sure that German banks would get paid. This was fine for Germany, who was already running an export surplus, but countries like Greece and Italy, who were more consumption based economies and relied on growing to keep paying down their debt, were now unable to finance their economic growth. That led to crippling economic conditions which could have been easily avoided. On an individual level, status is a major determinant of what debt means to a person. He adds to this the concept of Cadillac debtors. In the 1700s, nobility went to debtors' prisons and still lived in luxury, basically, often served by the poor who were in prison next to them, while those who lived in poverty uh, endured appalling conditions. For a more modern example, we can look at those who are held in prison for unpaid fines. You don't pay a traffic ticket, it compounds. Eventually, you're stuck in jail until you can come up with whatever money that the court has demanded you pay, de facto debtor's prison, versus a notable example of Donald Trump being 8 billion in debt with a negative net worth and still be considered wealthy and still allowed to proceed through life basically unmolested. Just the most visual example of a two-tiered system. And underpinning a lot of this is the threat of force, exemplified by the author in this vaudeville sketch. I was walking down the street with a friend the other day, and a guy with a gun jumps out of the alley and says, "Stick 'em up." As I pull out my wallet, I figure it shouldn't be a total loss. So I pull out some money, turned to my friend, and said, "Hey, Fred, here's that 50 bucks I owe you." The robber was so offended, he took out $1,000 of his own money, forced Fred to lend it to me at gunpoint, and then took it back again. The point here being, when you're the one with the gun, be it the United States, the IMF, or you're just particularly wealthy, you don't have to do anything you don't want to. And there's no chance that your money is lost because you risk giving it to somebody else, which sort of defies the concept of what a debt is in general, especially a debt like a loan. But when we coach these things in the language of debt, this relationship becomes obscured, like by common wisdom, like, well, surely you have to pay your debts, even if you incur them at the point of a gun. Adding to all of this are some cultural and religious perspectives on debt, which tend to be highly unfavorable to moneylenders. Sometimes both creditors and debtors are shown as deeply immoral. There are certain sects where you'll be reincarnated as an animal in the house of your creditor if you fail to pay up. Um, there's frequent Catholic imagery condemning users to hellfire and damnation. Uh, so frequently the culture disapproves, while at the same time these debts are commonplace. And we'll explore a little more later on what that how that tracks across time. Um, in the current moment, America is basically run on credit for the lower and middle classes to drive consumption. Um, there was the 2007 uh, Citibank advertisement to open a cravings account. Not exactly something that's coming down hard morally on debtors or creditors. But at this particular time, it seems much better to be a creditor. And we'll take a look at how that changes throughout history through the rest of the book. If you found any of this helpful, please make the normal sacrifices to the algorithm. Like, share, subscribe. If you thought this was a nuclear grade bad take, feel free to leave us a comment. For a dialogue-based summary, you can check out the Theorycast podcast, where we put some of this stuff in a modern context and pad it with whatever deranged rambling that comes to mind. Until next time, I'll be here reading and casting theory into the ether, searching for something that looks like enlightenment if you squint and turn your head a bit.